The words still echo in my mind. Translate this document, and my entire yearly salary is yours. The smirk on billionaire Marcus Wellington's face when he said it. The way the entire boardroom erupted in laughter. The absolute certainty in his voice that he was about to humiliate me in front of everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what happened next would wipe that smirk off his face forever and change the trajectory of my life in ways I never could have imagined. My name is David Rodriguez, and this is the story of how one translation challenge turned a house cleaner into something nobody saw coming. I've always been invisible. That's the nature of domestic work. You exist in the spaces between other people's lives, cleaning up their messes while they go about their important business. For 8 years, I worked for Elite Household Services, one of Chicago's most exclusive cleaning companies. Our clients weren't just wealthy, they were the kind of wealthy that most people only read about in Forbes magazine. The Wellington Mansion in Lincoln Park was my Tuesday and Friday assignment. 37 rooms spread across 3 floors, with Italian marble that cost more per square foot than most people make in a month. Marcus Wellington, the tech billionaire who owned the place, had built his empire on a revolutionary AI translation platform called Linguitech. At 39, he was worth approximately $4.2 billion and had the ego to match every zero in his net worth. Most days I arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, letting myself in through the service entrance with the key code that changed monthly. The house would be quiet, except for the soft hum of expensive air filtration systems and the distant sound of Wellington's home gym on the 3rd floor. He maintained a strict schedule. Workout from 6:30 to 7:30, breakfast in his private study while reviewing international market reports, then off to his downtown office by 9 a.m. I had perfected the art of timing my work to avoid crossing paths with him. Not because he was openly hostile. Wellington barely acknowledged my existence enough to be rude. I was simply part of the house's infrastructure, like the smart thermostats or the automated lighting systems. Functional, necessary, but not worthy of actual recognition. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, cleaning the home of a man who had made his fortune breaking down language barriers, while I remained completely invisible to him despite the fact that I spoke 5 languages fluently. English and Spanish from childhood, French from my time studying abroad before life circumstances forced me to drop out of Northwestern, German from my grandfather who had been a translator for the State Department, and Mandarin Chinese from evening classes I'd taken at the community college. But Wellington didn't know any of this. To him, I was just David, the quiet guy who made sure his Persian rugs were spotless and his crystal chandeliers gleamed. He had no idea that while I dusted his bookshelves filled with first-edition literature in multiple languages, I was often silently correcting the translation errors in the international newspapers scattered across his reading table. My routine at the Wellington house was methodical and efficient. 1st floor, the formal living areas, dining room, and kitchen that looked like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant, but was rarely used since Wellington typically ate at his office or attended business dinners. 2nd floor, his private study, master bedroom suite, and 2 guest rooms that hosted a rotating cast of business associates and family members. 3rd floor, the home gym, media room, and what Wellington called his war room, a high-tech office space where he held video conferences with international partners. It was in this war room that I first noticed the translation documents. Contracts, technical specifications, and legal papers in languages ranging from Japanese to Arabic to Portuguese. Wellington's company was expanding globally, and despite having created translation software, he still relied on human translators for the most sensitive business documents. I often found these papers scattered across his desk, covered in handwritten notes and corrections in red ink. The corrections were usually good, but not always perfect. Sometimes I'd notice subtle errors in cultural context or legal terminology that even professional translators missed if they weren't deeply familiar with both business cultures involved. But I kept these observations to myself. My job was to clean, not to offer unsolicited linguistic advice to a billionaire. Wellington's study was where I spent the most time each visit. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the private garden, and the walls were lined with awards, patents, and photographs of him meeting with world leaders and tech industry giants. His desk was a custom piece made from a single slab of Brazilian rosewood, usually covered with multiple computer monitors, tablets, and stacks of international business publications. This particular Tuesday morning in September started like any other. I arrived at 7 a.m., disabled the security system with my code, and began my usual routine. Wellington was already in his gym. I could hear the rhythmic sound of his rowing machine echoing from upstairs. The study was messier than usual, with documents in what appeared to be at least 6 different languages spread across every available surface. As I carefully dusted around the papers, being extra cautious not to disturb their order, I couldn't help but notice what appeared to be a major contract negotiation in progress. The documents were related to Wellington's acquisition of a German AI company called Neuralink Technologies. The technical specifications were in German, the legal framework in English, but there were also supporting documents in French, Italian, and what looked like simplified Chinese. The deal was clearly massive. I caught glimpses of figures in the hundreds of millions, but more interesting to me were the translation inconsistencies I noticed between the German technical documents and their English counterparts, subtle but potentially significant differences in how certain AI processes were described, the kind of nuances that could impact patent rights or regulatory approval. Again, I kept my observations to myself. Wellington appeared in the doorway at exactly 8:15, as was his habit, wearing his standard uniform of dark jeans and a black cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. He barely glanced in my direction as he settled at his desk with his usual breakfast: black coffee, steel-cut oats with blueberries, and a protein shake that looked like it contained ingredients I couldn't pronounce. "David," he said without looking up from his tablet, the first time he had addressed me directly in probably 6 months, "I need you to be extra careful around the desk today. These documents are part of a sensitive acquisition." "Of course, Mr. Wellington," I replied, continuing to dust the bookshelf behind him. "I'll be very careful." He nodded absently, already absorbed in his morning routine of scanning international news and stock reports. This was typically where our interaction would end, him forgetting I existed while I finished my work in respectful silence. But today was different. At exactly 8:47 a.m., Wellington's phone rang with the distinctive tone he had assigned to his most important business contacts. The conversation that followed would set in motion the chain of events that would change everything. "Marcus here," he answered in his characteristic, confident baritone. "Yes, I received the updated documents from Berlin. No, that's exactly the problem. The translation is inconsistent with what we discussed in Frankfurt." "What do you mean your team doesn't see any issues?" I continued my work, but it was impossible not to overhear. Wellington's voice was growing more frustrated with each exchange. "Look, Heinrich, I'm looking at Section 12.4 of the technical specifications. Your German version talks about adaptive algorithmic learning, but the English translation says responsive system modification. These are not the same thing, and the difference could affect our patent portfolio. No, I can't just accept your word for it. I need this translated properly before I sign anything." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, growing increasingly heated. When Wellington finally hung up, he was visibly agitated. He stood up from his desk, ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, and began pacing the length of the study. "Unbelievable," he muttered to himself. "I'm about to invest $300 million based on documents that can't even be translated consistently. How am I supposed to make informed decisions when I can't trust the information I'm receiving?" This was my cue to finish up quickly and leave him to his business frustrations. But as I moved toward the door with my cleaning supplies, Wellington suddenly turned and looked at me directly for the first time in months. "David, you've been working here for what, 5 years?" 8 years, sir," I corrected politely. 8 years, right. He studied me with the kind of attention usually reserved for potential business acquisitions. "You must have overheard a lot of business conversations in that time." I wasn't sure where this was going, but something in his tone made me cautious. "I don't listen to private conversations, Mr. Wellington. I just focus on my work." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course you don't. That would require understanding what you're hearing." The dismissive tone was back, the brief moment of direct attention already fading. "Never mind. Just finish up and let yourself out." But he didn't sit back down. Instead, he continued pacing, occasionally picking up documents from his desk and studying them with obvious frustration. The tension in the room was palpable, and I found myself working more slowly than usual, partly out of curiosity, and partly because the atmosphere made me nervous about making any noise that might further irritate him. That's when everything changed. At exactly 9:23 a.m., Wellington's phone rang again. This time, the conversation was brief, but clearly devastating. What do you mean the Frankfurt office has concerns about the contract language? No, that's impossible. We spent 3 weeks negotiating those exact terms. Yes, I understand German contract law is different, but that's why we hired translators. Fine. Set up a conference call for this afternoon. I need to sort this out before the board meeting tomorrow. When he hung up, Wellington stood perfectly still for a long moment, staring out the window at his meticulously maintained garden. Then he turned back to his desk, grabbed the stack of German documents, and held them up like evidence in a trial. You know what the problem is? He said, though he seemed to be talking more to himself than to me. Everyone thinks translation is simple. Just convert words from one language to another. But business isn't conducted in words. It's conducted in concepts, in cultural understanding, in the subtle implications that separate a successful deal from a legal nightmare. He looked at the documents again, then suddenly turned toward me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't quite desperation, but it was the closest thing to vulnerability I had ever witnessed from Marcus Wellington. David, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Do you speak any languages other than English? The question caught me completely off guard. In 8 years of working in his house, Wellington had never asked me a personal question. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond or why he was asking. Yes, sir, I speak Spanish. Just Spanish? Something in his tone made me decide to be completely truthful. Spanish, French, some German, and Mandarin Chinese. Wellington's eyebrows shot up. You speak German? Yes, sir. My grandfather taught me when I was young. He was a translator. For a moment, Wellington just stared at me as if I had announced I was secretly a space alien. Then his expression shifted to something that looked almost like calculation. Your grandfather was a translator, he repeated slowly, and you speak German. And you've been working in this house, listening to my business calls for 8 years. I began to feel uncomfortable. Mr. Wellington, I want to assure you that I never... David, he interrupted, and there was something different in his voice now. Something that sounded almost like opportunity. I have a proposition for you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The way Marcus Wellington said proposition made my skin crawl. In my 8 years of working for wealthy clients, I had learned that when billionaires offer propositions to their household staff, it rarely ends well for the staff member involved. What kind of proposition, Mr. Wellington? I asked carefully, setting down my cleaning supplies but keeping my distance from his desk. Wellington walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out what appeared to be a thick legal document, entirely in German, with official seals and signatures scattered throughout its pages. The paper was expensive, the kind used for contracts worth serious money. This, he said, holding up the document, is the original acquisition contract for Neuralink Technologies. 47 pages of German legal and technical language that will determine whether my company successfully acquires their AI patents or whether I lose the biggest deal of my career. He set the document on his desk with ceremonial gravity, as if it were a sacred text. My translation team has given me 3 different English versions of this contract, and all 3 have significant discrepancies. The Frankfurt office is claiming that my understanding of key terms is incorrect. My board of directors is meeting tomorrow morning to vote on the acquisition, and I can't recommend a $300 million investment based on translations I don't trust. I nodded politely, still not understanding where this was leading or why he was sharing such sensitive information with me. Wellington continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. You said you speak German. You said your grandfather was a translator. Here's what I'm thinking. I give you this contract. You translate the critical sections for me. And if your translation matches what I believe the terms should be, I'll give you a bonus. That's very generous, Mr. Wellington, but I don't think... $1,000 bonus, he interrupted, clearly thinking that the specific amount would change my mind. I blinked. $1,000 was significant money for me, nearly half a month's salary. But it was also obvious that Wellington was desperate, and probably not thinking clearly about what he was asking. Mr. Wellington, with respect, this sounds like something that should be handled by professional legal translators, not your house cleaner. This contract is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Wellington's expression shifted, and I caught a glimpse of the ruthless businessman beneath the polite veneer. David, let me be very clear about something. Professional translators are the reason I'm in this mess. I've paid 3 different firms a total of $45,000 for translations of this document, and I still don't have confidence in what I'm reading. He picked up the contract again, flipping through pages covered in dense German text. You know what I think? I think translation isn't really about credentials or fancy degrees. It's about actually understanding language. And you've been in this house for 8 years, listening to me conduct business in multiple languages, absorbing information whether you realize it or not. This was a side of Wellington I had never seen before. Beneath his usual arrogance was something approaching desperation, and it was making him say things that didn't make logical sense. But sir, legal translation requires specialized knowledge of German contract law, business terminology. Stop, Wellington said, holding up his hand. Let me ask you something else. In all your time working here, have you ever noticed errors in the international documents I receive? Translation mistakes, inconsistencies, things that didn't seem quite right? The question caught me off guard because the answer was yes. I had noticed errors, sometimes significant ones. But admitting that would mean confessing that I had been paying attention to his private business documents, which felt like a violation of the professional boundaries I had carefully maintained. Sometimes I might notice small things, but I would never presume to. Small things like what? Wellington's voice was sharp now, focused. Give me an example. I hesitated, looking toward the door as if I could escape this increasingly uncomfortable conversation. But Wellington was blocking my path, and something in his posture told me he wasn't going to let this go. Last month, I said reluctantly, there was a contract on your desk from a Japanese technology firm. The English translation referred to exclusive licensing rights, but the Japanese original used a term that's more accurately translated as, quote, preferential consideration for licensing. It's a significant legal difference. Wellington stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. You read Japanese too? Some. I took classes at community college. Jesus Christ, he muttered, running his hands through his hair again. You've been working in my house for 8 years and you speak 5 languages, and you've been catching translation errors in my business documents and you never thought to mention this? It wasn't my place to mention it, Mr. Wellington. I'm here to clean your house, not to audit your business correspondence. Wellington began pacing again, but this time his movement seemed energized rather than frustrated. Unbelievable. I've been paying tens of thousands of dollars to translation services, while my house cleaner has been silently correcting their work. The conversation was spiraling into territory that made me deeply uncomfortable. I had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, of doing my job, without getting involved in my clients' personal or professional lives. Now Wellington was suggesting that I abandon that professional distance for a translation project that was far beyond my qualifications. Mr. Wellington, I appreciate your confidence, but translating a legal contract worth $300 million isn't something I can take responsibility for. If I made an error, if I misunderstood something critical, then you'd be in the same position as the 3 professional firms I've already hired, Wellington interrupted. At least with you, I'd know that the person doing the translation has been absorbing the context of my business for years. He walked back to his desk and pulled out his checkbook, the kind that wealthy people still used for large transactions. With deliberate movements, he began writing. I'm going to sweeten the offer, he said without looking up. Not $1,000 bonus. I'm going to make you a bet. A bet? Wellington finished writing and tore the check from the book, holding it up so I could see the amount. My heart nearly stopped. The check was made out to David Rodriguez for $650,000. This, Wellington said, waving the check, is my annual salary, not my total compensation, not my stock options or bonuses, but my base salary as CEO of Linguatech. Here's the bet. You translate the critical sections of this German contract. If your translation is accurate, if it helps me understand what I'm actually agreeing to, this check is yours. I stared at the check, unable to process what I was seeing. $650,000, more money than I had ever imagined possessing, enough to change my life completely. And if I'm wrong? I managed to ask. Wellington shrugged. Then you're wrong, and you go back to cleaning my house. Nothing changes for you. But David... He leaned forward, his eyes intense. If you're right, if you can do what 3 professional firms couldn't do, then maybe we both learn something about assumptions and the value of paying attention. The check seemed to glow in his hands, representing possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. But I also understood the trap he was setting. This wasn't really about translation. It was about Wellington's ego and his need to prove that his instincts were superior to professional expertise. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "What do you really want from me?" Wellington's smile was sharp, almost predatory. "I want to see if the guy who's been invisible in my house for 8 years has been paying better attention than the experts I've been paying. I want to know if intelligence and observation can beat credentials and fancy degrees." He placed the check on his desk between us, a physical manifestation of the choice he was offering. "But here's the thing, David. I don't think you can do it. I think you're a house cleaner who happens to speak a few languages, and I think when you see the complexity of real legal and technical translation, you'll realize you're out of your depth. This bet isn't about giving you money. It's about proving a point." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a setup designed to humiliate me while making Wellington feel superior about his own judgment. "You think I'll fail," I said, the realization crystallizing. "I think you'll try your best and discover that there's a reason professional translators charge what they charge. But I'm curious enough about your observations that I'm willing to pay to find out." Wellington picked up the German contract and held it out toward me. "So what do you say, David? Ready to earn more money in one afternoon than you make in 10 years of cleaning houses? Or would you prefer to stick to what you know you can do?" The challenge hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that went far beyond translation. This was about class, about assumptions, about the invisible barriers that separate people like Marcus Wellington from people like me. I looked at the contract in his hands, then at the check on his desk, then back at his face with its expression of smug certainty. "Mr. Wellington," I said slowly, "I think you're going to be very surprised." I took the contract from Wellington's hands with steady fingers, though my heart was racing. The document was heavier than I expected, bound in dark blue leather with gold embossing. As I opened it, the crisp pages revealed dense blocks of German text, technical diagrams, and legal terminology that would intimidate most people. But not me. "How long do I have?" I asked, settling into the chair across from Wellington's desk. "The conference call with Frankfurt is at 2 p.m. That gives you," he checked his watch, 4.5 hours. Wellington clearly expected me to ask for more time, to make excuses, or to back down entirely. Instead, I opened to the first page and began reading. The language was complex, but the structure was familiar from the legal documents my grandfather had taught me to analyze years ago. Within minutes, I could see why Wellington's translation teams had struggled. The contract wasn't just written in German. It was written in German legal technical hybrid language, the kind that requires deep understanding of both cultures' business practices. "I need a laptop," I said without looking up from the document. "Excuse me?" "A laptop with internet access. Some of these technical terms have evolved since I learned German. I want to verify the most current usage in German AI patents." Wellington hesitated, clearly not expecting me to make professional requests. "There's a laptop on the credenza behind you. Password is LinguaTech 2023. For the next 2 hours, I worked in complete silence while Wellington attempted to conduct his normal business routine. But I could feel him watching me, observing my methodology, probably waiting for me to admit defeat. I started with the executive summary, translating each paragraph carefully and noting areas where the previous English versions had missed critical nuances. Then I moved to the technical specifications section, cross-referencing AI terminology with current German patent databases to ensure accuracy. The deeper I went into the document, the more errors I found in the previous translations. Not just linguistic errors, but conceptual misunderstandings that could have cost Wellington's company millions in future legal disputes. By noon, I had filled 8 pages with detailed translation notes. Wellington had given up pretending to work and was now openly staring at me as I worked. "David," he said finally, "what exactly are you finding?" I looked up from the laptop screen, where I had been verifying the German Federal Ministry's latest AI regulatory guidelines. "Your previous translators made some significant errors. The good news is that the deal is actually better than you thought. The bad news is that if you had signed based on their translations, you would have accidentally agreed to terms that don't exist in the German original." Wellington's face went pale. "What kind of terms?" "For example, Section 12.4 that you were arguing about on the phone this morning." Your English translation says you're acquiring adaptive algorithmic learning technology. But the German original specifies selbstlernende Algorithmusanpassung, which translates to self-learning algorithm adaptation. The difference is crucial for patent protection. I turned the laptop screen toward him, showing the German patent database entry I had found. Self-learning adaptation gives you much broader intellectual property rights than simple adaptive learning. Your translation team cost you potentially valuable patent coverage. Wellington leaned forward, studying the screen with intense focus. What else? For the next hour, I walked him through every significant discrepancy I had found. Licensing terms that were more favorable than translated, regulatory compliance requirements that were less restrictive than reported, and financial obligations that were structured differently than his English version suggested. With each explanation, Wellington's expression changed. The condescending skepticism gradually gave way to surprise, then to something approaching respect. The intellectual property transfer clause, I continued, pointing to section 23.7. Your translators interpreted this as a standard licensing agreement, but the German legal phrase vollständige Rechtsübertragung actually indicates complete rights transfer. You're not licensing Neuralink's technology. You're buying it outright, which is significantly more valuable. Wellington sat back in his chair, looking stunned. How much more valuable? Based on comparable AI patent portfolios, probably an additional 50 to 70 million in asset value that wasn't reflected in your previous assessments. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the laptop's cooling fan. Wellington stared at the contract, then at my translation notes, then at me. David, he said slowly, where did you really learn to do this? I closed the laptop and met his gaze directly. I told you, my grandfather was a State Department translator. But what I didn't mention is that I was 3 credits away from finishing a linguistics degree at Northwestern when my father died, and I had to leave school to support my family. Wellington's expression shifted again. You were at Northwestern. Dual major in Germanic languages and international business. I had already completed advanced courses in legal translation and cross-cultural business communication when I had to withdraw. When was this? 12 years ago. I've been working domestic jobs ever since, but I never stopped studying. Community college classes, online courses, language exchange programs. The world of international business doesn't stop evolving just because I'm cleaning houses instead of sitting in boardrooms. Wellington stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the garden where he probably paid someone else to maintain perfection. When he turned back, his entire demeanor had changed. David, I owe you an apology. I set this up to prove that expertise matters more than observation. I wanted to demonstrate that there's a reason people pay professionals for specialized work. And instead, I discovered that I've been paying the wrong professionals while ignoring someone who was more qualified than any of them. He picked up the check from his desk. This bet was never fair. I was trying to humiliate you to make myself feel better about my own frustration. Wellington walked around his desk and held out the check. But you've earned this, David. Not because of our bet, but because you've probably saved me from making a catastrophic business decision. I looked at the check but didn't take it immediately. Mr. Wellington, I need to ask you something. When you offered me this challenge, what did you really think would happen? He had the grace to look embarrassed. Honestly? I thought you'd struggle through a few pages, realize you were out of your depth, and give up. Then I'd have proven to myself that my instincts about people were correct, and I could go back to trusting expensive experts over intuition. And now? Wellington extended the check again. Now I'm wondering why my company's HR department isn't smart enough to recognize talent regardless of where they find it. I took the check, but kept my eyes on his face. What are you saying? I'm saying that Linguatech is expanding internationally, and we need someone who understands both language and business culture at a level that goes beyond what traditional translation services provide. Someone who can catch the kind of errors that could cost us hundreds of millions. He walked back to his desk and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to me. That's my direct number and email. I want you to consider joining Linguatech as our Director of International Business Translation. The salary would be $180,000 annually, plus equity, plus bonuses based on deal success. I stared at the card, then at the check still in my other hand. $650,000, plus a job offer that would change my life completely. Mr. Wellington, 4 hours ago you didn't even know I existed. 4 hours ago, I was an arrogant fool who confused visibility with value. He smiled, and for the first time since I'd known him, it seemed genuine. David, you've been in my house for 8 years, learning my business, understanding my industry, preparing for an opportunity that neither of us saw coming. That's not luck, that's dedication. I thought about my grandfather, who had always told me that language was power, but only if you were brave enough to use it. I thought about all the dreams I had deferred, all the potential I had packed away when life forced me to choose survival over ambition. "There's one condition," I said finally. Wellington raised an eyebrow. "You're negotiating?" Elite Household Services has other employees like me. People with education, with skills, with potential that gets overlooked because of what they do for work instead of what they're capable of doing. If I take this position, I want Linguatech to partner with them for recruiting. There's talent everywhere, Mr. Wellington. You just have to be willing to see it. Wellington considered this for a moment, then extended his hand. Deal. But I have one condition too. What's that? Never let me get away with underestimating people again. I clearly need someone around who's willing to call me out on my assumptions. As I shook his hand, I realized that this moment was about more than just a job or even life-changing money. It was about the recognition that intelligence and worth aren't determined by circumstances, but by what you do with the opportunities that present themselves. Mr. Wellington, I said, you're going to be very surprised by what invisible people can accomplish when someone finally decides to see them. 6 months later, I sat in that same study, but this time as Linguatech's Director of International Business Translation. The company had successfully acquired Neuralink Technologies, saving approximately $80 million in the process due to the accurate contract interpretation I had provided. But more importantly, Linguatech had hired 12 new employees through our partnership with service companies around Chicago. Former janitors who spoke Mandarin, housekeepers with engineering degrees, maintenance workers with business experience from their home countries. Wellington had learned that talent doesn't always come in the packages we expect, and I had learned that sometimes the biggest transformations happen when someone finally challenges us to prove exactly who we really are beneath the surface. The invisible man had become impossible to ignore, and that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.